And we are setting the stage for such a beautiful discussion today. A very important discussion in the 21st century, where we see the colonial system is still at work in so many African countries. Big up rebels like Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso, keeping the spirit alive. Let me tell you, this system needs you to rebel. Haitajiangusha. So your presence here and your action is very important. My name is Chief Matigari. Karibuni sana to the discussion today. Moto wa uhuru uzidi kuwaka. Sons and daughters of Mau Mau, we are still there. Bula Meshubu. My name is Chief Matigari, representing the Chief and the Marshal's crew. Karibuni to the panel discussion.
Welcome everyone, and we apologize for the delay in starting. This is African Timing 101. I have been back in Kenya for 2.5 years, and I still feel like I'm going to get high blood pressure because of African timing, but I am adjusting my expectations as we go along. Before we begin, I would like to give the most massive thank you to Wairimu, who pulled this together. Wairimu Gadimba. I literally got the news that Owen will be in town on Monday afternoon, and she has packed the room within 48 hours, so she is an absolute superstar. And for that, I am always grateful that she is my partner in crime. And thank you so much to Owen Jones for being available to be here with us today to have this conversation. And just for your information, he has volunteered himself as tribute so that we can put all the sins of empire, of British Empire, onto him, all the generations of sins. He is here to atone for them. So do not be kind, do not be gentle, do not. And then thank you so much to Sungu Oyoo and to Mumbi Kanyongo, who were also available on such short notice. And thank you to all of you for coming to have this conversation with us today. I am very, very excited about the conversation we're about to have. So we're going to talk for just about a half hour or 45 minutes so that we can make time for questions. But this is going to be a very free-flowing conversation. So just feel like you are part of this conversation. So it is interesting that we are gathered here today at Macmillan Library, which is literally a monument to British Empire's influence in Kenya. This library was started by the wife of a colonialist, and it was not open to black people until 1962, after we got independence. So we are literally, I do not want to say that we are dismantling empire, because we're not. But this is definitely, there's definitely something poetic about the fact that we are having this discussion here today. So the conversation today will be about the evolution of the role of the British Empire in Kenya and other post-colonial countries in Africa, but mostly Kenya because this is where we are today. And what we're going to think about is, are we really in a post-imperial world? Are we really in a post-colonial Kenya? And in what way has British influence either continued to survive, evolved, declined over the past couple of decades? And where are we today, especially given all these great geopolitical changes that we are witnessing across the world? And what do we expect moving forward? And what are young Kenyans thinking about when they think about their role in the world, especially their role in dismantling the imperial world order? So I think I want to get to take us back to colonization. You know, it's interesting. So Owen is here because he's writing a book about the decline of the West. And so he interviewed me just about an hour ago. And one of the questions he asked me is how aware our Kenyans are about their colonial history. And the truth is that if you went through the 844 system like I did, not very much. You know, like it's not, you know, I've lived in many countries. And Kenya is one of the countries where there's not as much consciousness about the role that colonialism played in our lives and continues to play in our lives today. You know, in our Independence Day, it's almost like, you know, we have conversations about what's happening. You know, we meet, we eat nyama, but we never really discuss in what way did colonization affect us? What did that look like? What did independence mean? Are we really independent? So that's the conversation we're going to have today. So I want to take us back to the pre-colonial era, and so that we can start to think about in what ways did the British, because it's not just a few people showed up here with a bunch of guns and then they tied us up forever. There are mechanisms that they used to ensure that we were subjugated and we remain subjugated today. And one of the major tools that they used is debt. And so I'm going to direct my first question to Sungu Oyoo, who is an activist, a writer, a poet, and is a spokesperson for Kongamano La Mapinduzi, and is an economist, and he's done some work on debt. So I think you're the right person to answer this question. Can you give us a description of how debt was used to build, to sustain, and to this day to maintain the role of empire in Kenya?
Asante sana, Comrade Mamka. Many thanks, Owen. Many thanks, Mumbi, and many thanks, everyone. I'm not really an economist, though I studied economics at the University of Nairobi. But I think I was taught more of capitalism than economics, and I've never practiced it in the real world. So I do not consider myself an economist, just someone who went to the School of Economics. I think if we are to look at debt and how it works, of course, debt is a tool of subjugation. And I think with regards to the British Empire in Kenya, perhaps one of the key questions around debt can be tied back to the land question, because Kenya was a settler colony. When the British colonized Kenya, empire never intended to leave. It intended to stay for as long as it could. The land was taken from its owners through the barrel of a gun. It was never bought from anyone, and people were displaced. A lot of people lost land. In the 50s, the War for National Liberation broke out, and it was around two key questions: land and freedom. And land remains a key question. It's a national question to this date. Most of the conflict in this country is around land. But in 1962, at the dawn of independence, after the Lancaster House negotiations, because there had been issues around land and the negotiations covered that. But because the negotiation process, the British made sure that they staffed it with people who would protect their interests, the Kenyatas and the who's and the who's, and who would not really advocate for that true freedom, that true liberation, that true land repossession and redistribution to its owners. They put a clause where, not even put a clause, okay, in 1962, Kenya was forced to take a loan from the British government of £2 million from the British government, the World Bank, and I think West Germany or the Colonial Office, but it was from three parties. They put together the money. This £2 million was to facilitate the purchase of 1 million acres of land from settlers who are departing. It's called the Million Acre Scheme. And to resettle those who had been dispossessed. in the 1900s, the periods up to 1920, who'd been dispossessed, especially in central Kenya, and who were in squatter camps and the informal settlements in urban Kenya. And Kenya, after taking this loan in 1962, only finished repaying it in the 80s, meaning that resources which could have gone to the process of social development, to processes of national development, were again being taken out of the country to buy back land from the British, who had never bought it from anyone. And so I think that is just one example when we talk about the question of debt. And I think there is a lot of many other similar debts. If you look at the old debt register, debts which really do not make sense. They are fictitious debt because we did not owe anyone anything. We do not owe anyone anything to this day and time. And so actually the Kenyan state and the Kenyan people are the ones who should be asking Britain, should be asking Empire to repay them these monies which were extorted out of them, because that is extortion. It is mafia-like business. It actually reflects like the case of Haiti, like when the French left and then they forced Haiti to repay them for the losses they had made. I mean, doesn't make any sense. Or when slavery ended in 1844 or whatever, and it's the slave owners who are compensated and not the enslaved people. And we know that colonialism, slavery is colonialism abroad, and colonialism is slavery at home. And so we were literally being forced to pay back the British Empire for having been colonized, for our land having been taken away from us. And it reflects colonial patterns of economics which live on to date. If we look at Kenya today, you look at the stock exchange right across the road, you'll find a large proportion of British conglomerates still listed there, and actually they are the majority. The land question persists to date, and I think in many ways it brings us to where we are as a country today, because the national economy has never been able to develop fully because the productive forces are not in the hands of the people. The land question, I think we really have to focus on that even as we discuss that. Asante.
Thank you so much, Sungu, for that. So I think based on what you've said, we remain, not only do we remain underdeveloped because of the role of Britain in Kenya, which is very contrary to a lot of what development economists will say, is the reason why we are underdeveloped. And so for that reason, I have to be curious, especially in a world with a lot of information, about the British public and how aware the British public is about the fact that that every time there's a child dying of malaria somewhere in the middle of a village in Kenya, it is because there's a debt that is being paid to a London banker, whether it is a legacy debt from the colonial era, or it is from the debts that exist today that are just a continuation of the role of empire. And to what extent is the British public even sort of open to the idea of reparations? And I know that is not a question you may have expected to answer today, but you volunteered tribute, so.
Well, firstly, it's an honour to be here as tribute, and thank you so much, honestly, Ramka, for inviting me along, and such an honour to be on such an incredible panel, and thanks again to you over there. And let's give another big round of applause to all the organisers, both the organisers, but you especially over there. I think, the first problem is the lack of any reckoning in Britain over its crimes, the crimes of empire. And that reckoning has never been had. And there was at least an opening, interestingly enough, after the police murder of George Floyd, and then the wave of Black Lives Matter protests which swept across not just the US but also in Britain, where, for example, statues of slavers were toppled. For example, in Bristol, a city which is built on the stolen wealth, not least from the slave trade, as is Liverpool and London, and suddenly all these statues which had been stood there since the 19th century or earlier were challenged. There was something of a discussion which was taken by, I suppose, our right-wing newspapers as an affront, an attack on British history, the attempt to actually talk about the reality of British history. I mean, the polling with empire is quite interesting because for those Britons over the age of 65, only 10% think the empire is more something to be ashamed of. 47% think it's more something to be proud of. But amongst younger Britons, there's been a big shift. So amongst those under 25, whereas only 10% think it's something to be ashamed of, 35% of younger Britons think it's something to be ashamed of, with just 24% saying more something to be proud of. I mean, those figures are still depressing in lots of ways, given the scale of the crimes that were committed in empire. But of course, because we don't, I mean, in our education system, there's so little discussion of empire, and on television, very little accurate representation of empire at all. And that leaves the British public unable to understand the present, because, of course, we can't understand the current structures of neo-colonialism if we don't have that reckoning about empire. I mean, we've had studies which have come out recently which have tried to quantify the sheer scale of theft. And there was one about India which found, it estimated, this was a few months ago, that $65 trillion worth was stolen from India by the British Empire. With Africa, there hasn't been an equivalent study, but again, of course, it's trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. What's interesting now, I mean, you know, some of the studies that have, again, don't have the public attention that they deserve, but one which a few years ago found that 101 companies listed on the London Stock Exchange have mining operations in Africa and combined control resources worth in excess, again, of $1 trillion. The overall structure, of course, of the global system is estimated the richest 1% in the global north extracted $30 million an hour from the global south through the global financial system in 2023. And research has shown that wages in the global south are 87 to 95% lower than wages in the global north for work of equal skill, so that despite contributing 90% of the labour that drives the global economy, workers in the global south only get 21% of global income. I mean, these are the sorts of figures which really flesh out what is neocolonialism. I mean, how can anyone look at those figures and not conclude that we're seeing the continued theft of wealth on a colossal scale embedded in the system? I mean, you know, global north countries control, of course, 70% of the global wealth. And at the moment, this was actually 10 years ago, so this is an out-of-date statistic. $192 billion is extracted from Africa. That was in that year, mainly in the form of profits by foreign companies, tax dodging, and of course, if we're talking about reparations, the costs of adapting to the climate emergency. Of course, the climate emergency overwhelmingly caused by the emissions of the global north, with the global south expected to pay the greatest cost. Is already paying the greatest cost. We're already seeing the extreme weather events, the destabilised ecosystems, the impact it's having on water, access, food, and so on. And then, I mean, that's without even talking about debt. I mean, because it's estimated $3 trillion worth of interest payments have gone from the global south to the global north since 1970. And I suppose the problem is with empire, because obviously it had to be rationalised with structures of racism at the time, and this neo-colonialism, it remains exactly the same. The discourse has nothing to do, or no understanding of the way the global economic system is structured. It will instead be racialised descriptions of corruption, for example, and you know, the failures of other of the once colonised countries to develop, and this idea of the British Empire perversely as an act of benevolence. Which brought, you know, great successes to the world. I mean, normally people just go on about train tracks. Just go about, they're obsessed with trains. But, you know, as was said about Mussolini, you know, the famous quote about Mussolini, he makes the trains run on time. Not quite justification for the terrible crimes that were committed by the British Empire. So because of that, we don't have an accurate discussion or description of what the British Empire was and what it did. It's often described in these historical revisionist terms of being acts of generosity rather than gross theft of resources, and therefore we don't have an understanding of the neo-colonial structures that replaced it. So until we have that reckoning with our past, we're not going to have that reckoning with our present.
Great. And so I think, so what you're saying is that because what was happening in colonial history was far more, in the colonial era, was far more visible, it was easier to fight. But what is happening in the neo-colonial era is much harder to fight, because the Mau Mau could organize against real people that they could see who were making their lives difficult in a very immediate and very sort of physical way. But at the moment, we are fighting against something that is very difficult to define, something that is very hegemonic. So it is almost impossible to see. And so, Mumbi, I want you to sort of describe that. Describe what the hegemony of imperialism has done and the sort of structures that it has set up that have made it almost impossible to fight against, almost impossible to even perceive, so that you can even start to mount a fight against it. Oh, yeah, and before that, Mumbi Kanyongo, the excellent Mumbi Kanyongo, she is a writer, she's a researcher, she's a mutual fund organizer, and an excellent human being all around.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be in this space with you. Thank you so much to Mamka and Marimo for inviting me, and of course, Owen and Sungu. It's lovely to be on this panel with you all. So I think for me, my starting point has to really directing our attention to what should be the subject of our analysis. Because I think in Kenya, we are so afraid of this question of class that we don't sort of think about how the way that settler colonialism was sort of implemented was towards the sort of implementation of racial capitalism. So I think that has to be our starting point. So who is the central sort of subject of racial capitalism? And that is people who are peasants, who are smallholder farmers, and that has always been the case over time. So I think that has to be our starting point. So Sungu was talking a lot about the question of land, but what was the logic sort of undergirding sort of this land dispossession? First, it was to direct people towards wage labor, because at the time, Africans were self-sufficient. It was these processes of producing food together, building homes together, this reproductive labor that is now seemingly and positioned as extremely menial and unmeaningful was really the base of society. But in order to drag people towards wage labor, it required land dispossession. And so we have to also think about what other sort of tools did the colonial state use to force people towards being disciplined by the wage. Because we start with this question, for example, right now of unemployment, but we're taking for granted the fact that people are actually dispossessed to make people desperate for work, right? So we have to start there. So in order to force people towards labor, there was also this question of taxes, unfair taxes. So of course people have heard about head taxes and hard taxes. And the important part here that is clear in our contemporary period is that these taxes were being sort of extracted, and people were not able to benefit from the sort of revenue that was coming from that taxation. That tax was being extracted in order to develop settler society, right? I think we also have to think about policing as an institute that was used in order to discipline people towards the wage. Because at the end of the day, what settler colonialism wanted to do was to redirect people's labor towards developing settler society, whether it was through the wage as a sort of whether it was you who was being forced to become a domestic worker, for example, in the settler home, or whether it was you who was forced to squat on a farm, even though you didn't have the resources to be able to farm your own land. The key here was that violence was sort of the mode that was used to discipline people into these modes. So you can see, for example, policing is often used as a way to sort of force people to do forced labor, for example. We're seeing prisons as spaces that are hanging over as a threat. If you don't engage in particular wage of labor, if you are caught in a particular place in a city that you are not meant to be, the prison was now the place that you were subjected to, and the police were now sort of the people that were used to enforce that. So I think we have to really think about what is it that creates this relation where we have people who are forced to come from their homes to the city, dispossessed of their land to go work on settler farms. And I think it's this particular system that shapes the sort of remnants of colonialism that we're experiencing today. So I think our starting point really has to be the most dispossessed as, the subject of our analysis. Yeah.
And that is a really interesting point you make, because, he who feeds you controls you. So to the extent that we have to rely on what we consider to be the produce that we no longer produce, then we are controlled. I think I want to stay on this point of the institutions that have remained, because you've talked about the hard taxes, you've talked about the dispossession, but we already now exist in a world where our land is commodified. We exist at a time when we exist in the capitalist system. We are at the periphery of capital, and so that means that we take it for granted. Every child who is born today takes it for granted that the only way that they're going to be able to make anything of a life for themselves is to exist within the system. But it's not our system. It is an inherited system. It is a global system, but it's an inherited system. So I want to come back to you, Sungu, to describe a little bit of the ways in which the institutions that we now take for granted, when we talk about our legal system, our constitutions, Mumbi mentioned our policing systems, our law and order systems, how these have been shaped by empire in ways that sustain our role even today at the periphery of the system that Mumbi is talking about, of global capital.
Thank you. Just before I get to it, I think what Owen said is really important, because we have to remember on the question of reparations. In 2022, when Ivory Coast introduced a motion at the United Nations against racism, xenophobia, and racial crimes, Rita French, who was then, Rita or Amber French, I don't remember the exact name, I think Rita, who was then the UK ambassador to the UN, said that they voted against it, and she said that it would open up, make the UK liable to pay reparations, especially during colonialism. So even at a structural level, we can see that reckoning has not happened. That era has been swept under the rug fundamentally. And just to come to your question about the institutions and the ways in which they still shape society today, I think there's a few examples that come to mind. Of course, we have the jail system, which you mentioned. Africans did not have prisons in their society, or if they existed, they were very minimal. And we know jails were created for poor people, which again brings the class question, because rich people can always afford bail. A poor person can be arrested for littering here on the street and go to jail. And a rich person can kill someone and get bail. And you can see how different those two things are. There's the policing system, which has really upheld the nature of the state, because Kenya is a neo-colonial state. The neo-colonial state is created in the image of the colonial state. It extracts, it humiliates our people, it condemns them to poverty, and in many instances, death. It's the very nature of its structure. I mean, if you're not shot by police bullets, you're going to die because there is no medicine in hospital. You are going to die because some system somewhere is not working as it should to uphold the value of life. And in the neo-colonial state, I think the police force is one thing that easily comes to mind, because the colonial police was created to beat the native into submission. And in the neo-colonial state, we see the ways in which the police force has continuously been used to protect systems of power. We see what was your question, comrade?
You are answering my question. You're answering my question. My question was the institutions, the invisible force.
Okay.
That maintains empire.
So there is, of course, the police force and the way in which it brings raw violence to the homes of the people. At an economic level, we see it in many ways. We see the so-called informal settlements. They're not really informal settlements. They're people's settlements which have been informalized, because if they are to be informal, then the people living there themselves are informal. But they're people's settlements. And so we see these are things which started in the colonial era, because there's people who had been dispossessed, these settlements. And as we move into the post-colonial state, we see that there is no deliberate effort to eradicate them. And instead, what happens is that there is more dispossession, and they grow larger, and they've become almost a permanent fixture of the urban landscape. And so, and you know, poverty is violence. It's actually, for me, it's the greatest form of violence you can subject a human being to. And we see their continued proliferation, or rather their continued growth in society. But thinking at a more fundamental level, I think even the institution of the state itself really has worked against the people, because most African societies had collective kinds of leadership where decisions were made by a council of elders. In many societies, it was a very patriarchal structure, but it was collective in some way. And then we see with the coming of the state, the colonial state introduces the concepts of chiefs as people who rule particular areas and whatnot. And then in the neo-colonial state, we now have these nationalist leaders. And in a place like Kenya, I don't think we have nationalist leaders. We have ethnic warlords who use the people as bargaining chips in the national politics. And them being ethnic warlords is a legacy of the colonial system. Because under colonialism, especially in the 30s, there was this law, I don't remember its exact name, where you couldn't organize politically outside of your district. And then so most of the parties or political organizations formed at that time were either, let's say, in Ukambani or in Luo land or in Kikuyu land. And so they were formed along ethnic lines. And when national organizing was finally allowed, I think in the late 40s or early 50s, these ethnic groups just bundled together under the nationalist party, KANU. But the party still retained these ethnic characteristics whose legacies play or continue to live in the national politics to this date. In fact, the Kenyan politicians have even now perfected the divide and rule tactic. They're always, like you mentioned, always marching to Chatham. I can't pronounce it. I mean, I'm an African. Chatham, yeah. Chatham House before elections and whatnot, because they must go to pay their respects to their masters across the ocean. Thank you.
I am really glad you ended with the Chatham House, because this is exactly where I was going. You know, one of the ways in which Britain maintained their foothold in Kenya, the British Empire, and just the Western imperial apparatus overall, has been through, quote-unquote, technical cooperation and aid. Aid has been an incredibly effective tool of maintaining domination on the continent. And so I want to put this question to you, Owen, in two parts. The first part is that, I mean, in your remarks, you talked about sort of the conception in the average, I'm going to call it the average British mind, of colonialism as benevolence. And I can imagine that is even more so in the context of international cooperation, that this is charity. You know, I know that questions are being asked recently about, the UK and charity. And so my question is this. One, what is the sort of evolution of the use of aid as a tool of maintaining colonial domination? And the second part of the question that sort of dovetails with that one is that to the extent that there is an evolving role, how much of it is being determined by what you're writing about, which is this decline of empire? And just to sort of preface that with what is happening in the U.S. right now, where Trump demolished USAID, under the banner of sort of making America great again. And I'm not sure how he doesn't seem to realize that USAID was one of the most cost-effective ways of dominating the world by ensuring that, that there was, of advancing the American hegemony. So is that sort of like, that sort of paradoxical way of thinking, and is in this sort of like era of the decline of empire? I mean, That's a non-specific question, but I think you know what I'm asking, so I'll let you.
Well, it's a really, really important question because obviously, with the gutting of US aid, you got a discussion, quite a defensive discussion about US aid, which didn't interrogate the way it was used to promote the economic interests of US elites. What happened in the aftermath? The British Labour government of Keir Starmer slashed the foreign aid budget. It had originally been set at 0.7% of GDP. It's now been gutted down to 0.3%, but that's also inclusive of money spent, for example, on very limited, obviously, on refugees. In practice, it's just an implosion of that budget, which includes limited support, I have to say, for example, Palestinians in Gaza, and that is a genocide which the British government continues to facilitate. We provide the crucial components for the F-35 jets, and that's a recurring theme where you get the British states engaged in heinous war crimes, but then attempting through soft power to disguise that fact by focusing on the question of aid. But I think more specifically, and this is a discussion which isn't properly had, partly I think because in the British context, the critiques of foreign aid have so overwhelmingly come from the British right, which is, for example, how the international aid budget has been used by the UK to, for example, promote privatisation, including in Africa. I mean, it was used to rewrite the energy laws it was used to help promote the privatisation of the energy sector in Nigeria, for example. I mean, that was all under the auspices of UK aid in order to encourage the opening up of Nigerian energy to Western multinational corporations. We've seen this previously, by the way, in other examples with water as well, and other crucial services. And that isn't a discussion that is had largely because you get this, I suppose, a very flawed discussion, which is generally between the right, which will say, why are we wasting taxpayers' money abroad? Sometimes they will say, well, we could be looking after our own people, but in practice they support cutting the welfare state at home as well, so they don't actually want to use that money for anything else. And then a kind of progressive knee-jerk response, which is not to look at the very problematic ways that UK aid has been used to promote the economic interests of big business over and above the needs, for example, of people in Africa who clearly did not benefit from having their energy privatised. I mean, it was a disaster in the UK for that matter. So I think that, was there something else I was supposed to, was that two parts? Yeah, so I think that's the discussion. It's an important discussion to be had because, obviously there'd be a different discussion to be had about the question of reparations and about changing what would be more helpful would be obviously to challenge and overturn an economic global system which is rigged in favour of British economic interests. That is a really important point. I mean, just on that, because obviously what Britain does is say, look, we provide this amount of money for vaccinations, for example, at the same time, there's a far worse damage being done to people because of an economic system rigged in favour of the likes of Britain. But what is absolutely unquestionably true is we're seeing, of course, the rise of China and the abandonment of US aid, the gutting of the foreign aid budget by Britain is clearly a retreat in what is called soft power. And for China, this is obviously a huge opportunity, and this represents a further stage in the rise of China, which, as the West declines, is increasingly will fill the vacuum. And we've already seen that to a large degree with China's global strategy, but the gutting of US aid and the UK aid budget is definitely part of that ascent.
Great, thank you so much for that. So, so you talk about soft power, but let's talk about hard power, because to look at Kenya today, there's my pen. To look at Kenya today, you would imagine that we are fundamentally a sort of a free country existing within this sort of global capitalist system, but nevertheless a free country. But there are still large swathes of land in this country that are still occupied by colonialists. We still have military training bases of the UK here alongside the U.S., of course, and these are not accidental occurrences. The soft power that we have just talked about, aid, is often used as a cover-up to allow that sort of military presence and that sort of interplay between the Kenyan military and the British military that also makes us a pretty sort of lethal neo-colonial force on the continent as well. And for this one, I want to come to you, Sungu, simply because I know you lived in Laikipia for a while, to talk a little bit about the continuing possession of land and the military presence in Kenya of the British, and what are Kenyans doing about it, and to what extent is the Kenyan public even aware of this?
The land question, like I said at the beginning, is one of those questions that will have to be answered in the fullness of time, because the amount of dispossession that happened at the turn of the 20th century is unimaginable. This was a settler colonial state, and people were pushed out of their land. Their land was stolen from them through the barrel of a gun. In many places, in many parts of Kenya, no, not in many, in few parts of Kenya, some of the land found ways to revert. Part of the land left by the departing settlers was also stolen by some of the leaders in the post-colonial government, but most of it actually retained, the ownership remained the same. I'll get to Laikipia, but when we start from Nanyuki, Kericho and all these areas where you have the tea plantations, you have the Brook Bonds and the Who's and these huge companies that still control the land, and you move to places like Laikipia, where you have, let's say, an individual like Kuki Galman or Al Niro Ranch is 100,000 acres, while you come to the capital and you see that probably 80% of Nairobi's population lives on 6% of its total landmass, and then you can see the levels of inequality in this society, and which directly arise out of that initial dispossession around the land. So if you put together Kibra, Madare, and all these people's settlements, they have more than 80% of Nairobi's population, but they occupy a really small area of Nairobi's landmass. And I think the land question is one of those questions that will have to be addressed if we are to say we want to start afresh, economically speaking, because as Africans we are connected to the land. When we are born, our umbilical cord is buried in the land. When we die, we are buried in the land. And so if you don't even have land to bury your dead in, you have to go to the cemetery and pay the city council to bury your dead. It's the highest level of indignity that I think an African person can have. And I think there have been certain mechanisms that have been proposed, both in the past and in the present. For example, I think I'm not sure of what article, it's 68 maybe in the Constitution, which mandates Parliament to set a land ceiling. For example, in Japan, I think the land ceiling is you can't own more than 5,000 acres. I mean, 5,000 is still a lot, and you could do a lot with it. In Kenya, people have, look at Uhuru, the Kenyatta family, and all that land they have. I mean, we should have a land ceiling so that there can be a process of land repossession and land redistribution. The land that has also been grabbed by public servants, so-called public servants, in this country, as outlined in the Ndungu report, also need to revert back to the people. I think, Kenya is such a huge country, and sometimes you sit and you wonder, people are dying of hunger. People are dying of hunger in this country. There is rain, there is fertile soil, there is everything. People are still dying of hunger. People do not have places to live. There is swaths of unoccupied land. And now again, there is a new wave of colonization, especially in the Laikipia area, where you see conservation being used as a front. I must qualify this statement. There is a lot of genuine conservation efforts, but there is conservation that is also being used to drive pastoralist communities out of their land. And I think these are some of the questions that must be addressed by this generation as part of its historical responsibility in resetting the country. In Laikipia, like I said, there's the conservation, and now it's even gone a notch higher, because of course, people have freehold title or leasehold title. There is community land and whatnot. Some of this land is now being listed as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Meaning that, how do you list a 50,000 acre piece of land as a UNESCO World Heritage Site? That it is so beautiful, it should never be touched. What that means is even the state doesn't have the power to repossess it directly. It must first go to UNESCO. And so we can see these new mechanisms that if the state, for example, said we want to repossess this land to resettle people, will pay. It is impossible if it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site because they're going to interfere with it. And I think there's ways in which global mechanisms are being used to further exacerbate the land question in Kenya. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but thank you.
You focused on the land, and I think that was very important. I did ask about the military, but we can come back to that. We can come back.
Oh, I was actually saying, yes, the British military still trains in Laikipia and areas around there, up to Archer's Post in Isiolo and where. And I think it's one of those elements of hard power, of the continued nature of the colonial relation. Actually, in Nanyuki, they share a fence with the Laikipia Air Base. I'm sure they are listening to everything being said in there.
So there's so many more questions I want to ask, but I want to finish with you, Mumbi, before we go to the audience for questions. Mumbi, Owen was asking me earlier about the decolonial process in Kenya, and I said, I think to me, colonization is complete in Kenya. That even if we tried, even if we got Batuk out of Kenya, even if we got our land from Kericho and Laikipia back, even if we changed our textbooks and whatnot, there's still something so fundamentally broken that happened in that process of colonization. There's a trauma that is so deep that it is almost hard to heal by its invisibility, because it is in almost every institution and every part of our culture as a people. And I want to bring that to you using an example. Francophone Africa since 2020 has had at least 6 successful coups. There has been 0 of them in Anglophone Africa. So there's something unique to the way the British colonized that has broken our spirit or changed our culture in a way that makes it impossible for us to even perceive of a possible different future. And maybe that sounds extremely cynical, but I'm bringing it to you so that you can put some sunshine in that darkness that I have just thrown at you.
Yeah, out of luck. I'm also a cynical person. So I think there's 2 things I wanted to draw attention to. One was the terms of our decolonization in Kenya. Of course, it was the way that the British suppressed the Mau Mau, the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, was extremely brutal. But part of that process also included a process of completely suppressing the left in Kenya. So it included, one, suppressing the most radical trade unionists. So, for example, there was one which was called, I think, the African Dock Workers Union. The Kenya Africa Workers Congress. It was led by Marxists who were really bringing up these questions of land and sovereignty at a time when KANU was not interested in thinking about decolonization, these terms. So KANU was interested in thinking about just the transfer of labor, of freedom from white people to Africans. So there was that process of creating KOTU, which included suppressing the most radical Marxist trade unionists, collapsing them literally in the period of a day. It happened in a day. Actually, there was a court case that was brought in 2012 by those radical unionists really challenging the state for that process that happened. So we really need to think about the terms of that process. So there was the formation of KOTU, for example. There was the murder and assassination of our most radical politicians, Piogama Pinto. There was also the removal of radical politicians from the public space. So you had the sidelining of Bildad Kagia through sort of illegal KANU elections that happened right after the colonial period. And then also you had this process of sort of naturalizing sort of capitalism as an African system. So you had Kanu who was pushing this propaganda that actually capitalism is something that Africans have always held. I say this all to say that what that period did was to constrain Kenya's public imagination about what's possible. It was to reduce our options to debating sort of, not debating sort of the importance of a liberal democratic capitalist project. It meant that we were simply sort of arguing within the constraints of that system. So right now you have sort of discourses that are navigated around this question of good governance. What is good governance, guys? What is it? And why is it seen as such a fundamental question without really interrogating this question of capitalism, of colonialism, the question of land, these things that actually shape our society today? So there's a way that that process of decolonization constrained our public imagination. And then now we, and then we get into a point where additionally you have NGOs who become you replace Kenyan's agency with sort of a non-profit industrial complex, which means that we never get to have the agency in order to sort of reclaim our sovereignty and to answer these questions of land, of labor. These questions are constantly outsourced to organizations which are not necessarily interested in challenging systems, interested in sort of, sort of vanity metrics of progress within a system that's ultimately sort of configured for people's death. Like, we're not really challenging systems. We have sort of NGOs that are not interested in sort of an end to capitalism and to colonialism, but instead how we can navigate within these systems. And so for me, what was important about 2024 was young people, not even young people, let's say people across generations reclaiming that agency and saying that it's us who determine the sort of questions that we should be answering in this moment. It's not that freedom is something that is outsourced to organizations that don't have our best interests at heart. So for me, the question and why it's such a sort of bleak, why I feel like, this question of liberation is so bleak in Kenya relative to other countries is because of the limits and constraints that have been put on our public imagination, and the fact that we constantly have to debate solutions within the constraints of capitalism, which means that we can never get to the root issues of what we're trying to deal with. So I think what it is that we need to pose new questions, as Sungu was saying, and not necessarily new questions, but old questions that need to be answered urgently, and questions that are sort of posed by Kenyans, not outsourced to NGOs, international organizations, imperialists. We need to determine the sort of terms of our own decolonization. Yeah.
That's an amazing, amazing place to end. If none of you have questions, I have like 15 more questions I want to ask them. But I'm going to try and be generous and come to the audience now to field a couple of questions. So I see a question here, I see a question here, I see a question there. Maybe we can start with the three cluster over here and then move to the cluster at the back.
Hi, my name is Peace, and I have more of like a general question for everyone here and also for the panelists that are here today, but this is for everyone to reflect on. A lot of what was talked about today is that we inherited a lot of systems and we function in these systems. And in order for change to happen, my question is, what for the panelists have you given up or are you willing to give up to see the world that you want to see? And also for everyone here today, what are you willing to give up? Because a lot of us also experience a lot of privileges from the system as it currently is. So what is it that we are willing to give up / embrace in order to take this that exists away?
Many thanks. My name is Ken Gishinga, and I'm an economist by profession. If you look at Kenya and compare it to Ethiopia or Tanzania, so you have Ethiopia that has never been colonized, you have Kenya that has been colonized deep in the capitalist system, then you have Tanzania that dabbled with socialism, the Ujamaa if you look at the standards of living as we speak today, Kenya seems to enjoy a higher standard of living than Ethiopia. If you look at health outcomes, education outcomes, democracy, freedom of speech, Kenya seems to be winning Ethiopia on those areas. If you look at Kenya and Tanzania, many Tanzanians will say Ujamaa was very problematic. It became unsustainable at some point. So do you think the fact that Kenya seems to enjoy a higher standards of living, and granted it still has a lot of challenges which you've mentioned, but the fact that it enjoys a higher standards of living than its peers who were never colonized, do you think that might complicate your argument?
Okay, so maybe I will first, I wanted to comment this to all the panelists. Funnily enough, it's kind of appropriate to the last thing you just said. You, Manka, you've really talked about how we have this guilt-tripping of Africans being told you owe us for bringing civilization and all of that. And Owen, you've really touched on that as well. And really trying to talk about how, we built this system. It was our effort. It was our effort as the colonizing power. Well, I actually was reading about this the other day, and there was the book that I'm reading really quantifies just how much Africans contributed financially to the budget of the running of Kenya. And I'll just read it very quickly. I hope I don't take time. So during the 1920s in Kenya, there was a substantial expenditure on infrastructure, including cross payments with regard to the railway administration, which is the thing that we are really tripped over about. Oh, we brought the rail, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So the expenditure in the Kenya colony rose from 1,909,051 pounds in 1922 to 3,114,912 in 1930. So funnily enough, this was very clearly said that it would be paid by the Africans, because here it actually also says here that it was clear that the administration in Kenya had minimal support from the metropolitan government during this period of time. Why? Because 75% of the budget was actually contributing in terms of workers, laborers, the people who actually went into making the railway. That's not just the Indians who came over as coolies, but also the African peasants who are contributing the food. The whole ecosystem of the building of the railway could be owed to the natives themselves by 75%. So my question would be here, my question here would be like, what do you think about how much Britain actually says they contribute in the abstract versus in the material sense? Because I will poster a lot of what was contributed in the material sense during the colonial period came from Africans themselves, right? So, and then to Mumbi very quickly. So you've really talked about racializing capitalism. I really, the first one was for the both of you. So you know. So you really talked about racializing capitalism, and I've really thought about the Indian question particularly. If we look right now, for example, the only person who can come to close at being called the head bourgeois capitalist in Kenya would be Manu Chandaria, in terms of like the industrialization, native industrialization. He's really at the top of it, and right now he's Ruto's advisor and all of that. It really talks about the history of Indians in Kenya. Because when you look at it, the proletarianization of labor in Kenya started with Indians, right? They didn't want to proletarianize Africans because they wanted to keep them as far from industry as possible, hence the huge reliance on Africans as peasantry. But even with the Indians being proletarianized so much such that at least they were able to be like the first real middle class in Kenya, like putting aside the settlers who aren't really a middle class, but more the elite. But that racial tension really has been evident in Kenya and in East Africa in general. To take, for example, Idi Amin and his expulsion of Indians from Uganda. So the other thing that you mentioned that I want to pair this together now, that you have something to talk about, is the Kano mentality. We decide we want to switch from white to black, but the system itself is maintained. You know, Idi Amin himself had that mentality when he was like, we want to get rid of the Indian bourgeoisie in Uganda so that we can own the Ugandan economy. But the reality is that it was just changing the capitalist structure in Uganda to be now shifted black, right? So, but that racial tension, it's very hard to disentangle for the general public because if you tell them not all Indians are bad, right? You'll see that for them they just see actually like the people who are far removed from like. Yeah, not being on the streets and blah blah blah. It's Indians, but at the same time, you still have Indian figures who have rose up to actually challenge the status quo in such a fundamental way. For example, when you've talked about Pio Gamapinto, when you've talked about Makan Singh, maybe that points to the whole issue of like how little we are taught in the 844 system. Because if you actually get to know this, then you can know, okay, well, we don't have to fixate so much on race. And
Kiritu, I'm going to have to wrap you up. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. So that's my last question. I hope you get the general trend of what I want to talk about, Mumbi, right?
So let me bring these questions back to the speakers. Thank you. So I think the first question was on the privileges of the system, and I'll direct that one at Owen because how much, as a British lefty, are you willing to give up to dismantle empire? And then on the question of capitalism, I will direct that one at, because again, I think that speaks to the limitations of our imagination, and so I will direct that at you, Mumbi. And then the contribution of Africans to the colonial development process, I will direct that towards Sungu. Actually, I know you directed it at me, but I'll direct it towards him. And then we can ponder the question on the racial dynamics of... actually, you directed it at Mumbi, so let Mumbi just answer that question. So on the privileges of the system.
Well, I hope it's not a cop-out to say that, you know, my answer would be a systemic answer, because it's the same with the climate emergency. People are asked, what would you give up in order to deal with the climate emergency? And it's often portrayed as what individuals will do as a sacrifice rather than how we get systemic change. And what I would give up is a world rigged in favour of the Western states who colonised and plundered the world and who have since maintained structures of colonialism and domination, which has favoured principally, of course, those elites, but not just exclusively the very top of those Western societies. And that means, obviously, you know, the reason I'm here is I'm writing a book called The Fall of the West. I mean, the Western supremacy is collapsing as it is. And what, you know, has been so fascinating, we talked about before, or slightly alluded to, for example, the military questions. And again, this comes back to the failure of the Brits to see themselves as the world sees them. You know, only 22 countries on earth haven't been invaded by Britain, which is kind of astonishing. But Britain has this sense of benevolence. We stood alone during World War II and completely airbrushed the reality of the Soviet Union having won that war overwhelmingly. So, I mean, what all Brits need to do is be forced to have a reckoning about our past. It's in order to understand how we can help end a world rigged in favour of Western economic interests. And we are just so far away from doing that at the moment, which is why what we're seeing at the moment is a slightly chaotic, turbulent decline in Western power due to military defeats, military humiliations in Afghanistan and Iraq, economic crisis, an economic model that is falling apart, which never recovered from the 2008 financial crash. And and just finally on the question of, you know, moral supremacy, which was always based on lies. It's fascinating because I'm interviewing Mau Mau veterans tomorrow, and the lawyers in Britain who championed the cases of the Mau Mau veterans, taking them through the British justice system, are today representing the victims of war crimes in Afghanistan and Iraq, which are completely kept from the British public. Just the other day, there's a report of children being handcuffed by British troops and then shot in the head. No understanding of that whatsoever. And the fact those lawyers in Britain are taking up those cases is instructive, because we didn't have a reckoning about what, for example, we did in this country just years after the war. The lawyer I was speaking to is a Jewish Brit, and he was saying, this was the end of World War II, and, there's this discussion about, obviously the Nazi Holocaust of the Jewish people, 6 million exterminated, and that presented as what Brits did to end that. And just a few years later, Brits were herding Kenyans into concentration camps and slaughtering them by the thousand. So for me, what we need to give up in the West is obviously that supremacy that we have, which is based on lies, and that means we have to give up our delusions. We have to give up our delusions about who we are and what we did and the world that we have forged, which remains rigged in our interests. So yeah, that's my long answer.
Yeah, so I wish you had said what it is that we can do to force you to give up those delusions, but I feel like maybe there might be people here listening to hear that. So Mumbi, on the question of that Ken has put to us, that we have all these benefits. Kenya, we are doing so well, aren't we? Because of capitalism, unlike our neighbors Ethiopia and Tanzania.
I guess the question I'd ask back is prosperity for who? Because I think what we're... lazima iwak. That's a good one. So yeah, I was asking this question of prosperity for who, because I think we're in a sort of, like a flashpoint where people are really asking this question of what is it that we're sort of measuring development by. I imagine that the sort of statistics we are using to make those conclusions were GDP per capita, GNI per cap, all that kind of thing. But I think the question that, for example, China really poses for us is what kind of standard of living can we get when there's serious social provisioning, which we don't have in Kenya, for example. So what we're seeing is maybe let me give you an example. So Kenya has had sort of sustained economic growth for the last period, however long. If you look at the graphs, it's been going up since maybe the end of Moi's rule. But there was actually a World Bank report that I was reading where they were saying that in the last few years, Kenya's growth has actually been driven by the service industry. But when we think about who enters the service industry, it's typically people who have been dispossessed of land and can no longer provide for themselves in rural areas. And they come to the city and enter service industry. But when they enter service industry, what kind of jobs are they getting? The lowest paid jobs. Truly jobs that cannot sustain them in terms of putting food on the table, in terms of getting access to housing, in terms of taking their children to school. It's poverty wages. And so the question really has to be, how is it that we're measuring our development, and what is the goal of our development? Is it an ending growth, which we're seeing in the West is unsustainable? You have people who are, ever increasing levels of poverty in these countries that have, vast amounts of wealth, and also at the same time precipitating some of the West, climate crisis at the moment. What does it mean to be pursuing growth? And then the other thing is that the way that the West was able to pursue growth was by subjugating the global South and by extracting huge amounts of labor and wealth, and that's ultimately what enabled them to industrialize and produce the type of wealth that they have. But that pathway is not available to us. It's not available to us. That's a complete delusion. We're never going to get there. Yeah, so, even as we're making these kinds of comparisons, I think we also have to put it within the context of imperialism, which is what we're thinking about today. There's a way that it can be argued that a lot of the reason that Kenya has higher levels of development than its neighbors is because Kenya was a settler colony. So, it's not that we had this we had this two-tier system where even though wealth was being extracted and taken out, there was also a portion of wealth that was being used to develop the settler life in Kenya. And that's what we inherited that sort of undergirds our economy today. So, yeah, I think we really need to question what it is that we're measuring development by. Like, is this really the metric that we need right now?
Yeah. And that's a very good point at which to pivot to the question about and even the infrastructure, the institutions that were created to sustain that extractive mechanism that, as you're saying, we are benefiting from, at least at the margins. Mm-hmm. A lot of that, as Kiritu said, was actually set up, it was actually the blood and sweat of Africans. And so, Sungu, do you want to take that question?
I'll take it up, and I think I'll also respond to Kenneth's question. I'll just put them together, and Kiritu's question. I think, like Mumbi said, given that Kenya was a settler colony, the native had to be trained to take orders. At independence, Kenya had a higher literacy rate compared to the other countries in East Africa. So even your education was not to benefit you per se, but to enable the smooth operation of the colonial mechanism and infrastructure. And when we talk of standards of living, I mean, I think we have to do a concrete analysis of the concrete conditions. Countries like Tanzania, throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, put a lot of their resources, which could have gone to the process of national development, towards supporting liberation movements in Southern Africa. They paid a personal sacrifice so that all of the rest of Africa could be free. And so it took them a long time to catch up, but now when you look at the economy, they are breathing down the economy of Kenya's neck, which never supported those struggles. I think we have to do this analysis in totality and not just look at the metrics, at GDP and whatnot. And actually, and you also mentioned Ethiopia, I'll not go deep into it, but Ethiopia itself was an imperial project in that there is a section of people who colonized other people within what we today call Ethiopia, which is why at the Berlin conference, Ethiopia sent representatives. They were on the negotiating table when there was negotiations about how Africa would be carved up and divided like a pizza. So I think we have to take all these facts in totality, and just to point out that actually the country with the highest metric, the country with the highest standard of living in the whole of Africa is Eritrea, which is under sanctions. Eritrea has the highest literacy rate, I think at 98%, has the highest life expectancy. Christianity, commerce, and civilization. At least that's what the colonial enterprise claimed it was coming to do. But they instead brought dominion, destruction, and death to those who had been colonized. And to a large extent, the Indians in Kenya were also victims of that system, in that most of them were brought to Kenya through systems of indentured labor, and they were highly exploited. And in the course of their stay in Kenya, the British also, in the course of the Indians being brought to Kenya, the British also brought what Mumbi was referring to earlier. They created a stratified system in society on the basis of race and put the Indians kind of as a middle class, kind of as a buffer between them and the African people. In that process, however, I think there's a lot of Indians who have contributed to Kenya in different ways. We have figures like Pio Gama Pinto, who were active during the struggle for national liberation, Makan Singh in the trade union movement. But of course, there is also exploitative patterns that have arisen in Kenya, and we have to be honest and open and speak about them. And Paulo Freire tells us the most unfortunate thing is when the oppressed adapt the image of the oppressor. And so you look at the labor relations, for example, in industrial area and other areas, and how a few members of the Indian community treat black people, then you see that it is an unjust situation. But I think we have to look at it in totality, because it is possible that in our analysis we develop forms of action that negate history. And we must be courageous enough to also run away from the trauma of colonialism and be able to imagine the size of freedom. Because part of the problem with systems of domination is sometimes they even render us incapable of imagining what freedom looks like what a free society could be. And I think which is why the events of last year, especially the younger generation, the Gen Zs, really put a lot of joy in my heart that the forward march of society into history is still in progress, because the people are the makers of history. History does not fall from the sky. But to get to the last point, I'm not sure what I'm saying, but to get to the last point of what you said, Kiritu, on the economics, I actually just remembered Walter Rodney did that analysis on economic growth patterns across the world over the past few hundred years. And if you study it intensively, especially in how Europe underdeveloped Africa, you see that the fastest periods of economic growth for Europe were during the eras of slavery and colonialism. Because at that point, they were exploiting the labor, forced labor. They had appropriated the land. Empire had appropriated the land. And there was so many other exploitative relations that existed at an economic level that could enable Europe to grow at that pace at that time. So, of course, Europe, to a large extent, was built on the exploitation of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me see. I saw some hands at the back, and I know we have concentrated here, so I feel like we need to go to the back for our final round of questions. And I will ask you to keep it very short. Very concise questions, please.
1, 2.
3 more questions.
Okay, I'm just going to stand because I'm short. Hi, everyone. So my question is more so on reparations, because it's something that you've touched on a bit. And also the first question that was asked about what you'd give up, understanding the privileges that you have. And I wanted to say, linking it to the whole idea of imagination and us imagining alternative futures, how are we looking at reparations beyond just the monetary sense of being quote-unquote paid back? How else can we apply reparations to repair that deeply fundamental thing that's broken, so our spirits, our cultures, our identities, etc.? How far are we willing to take reparations to transform our lives and to transform our material realities? Linking back to the question you asked, the first lady who asked, what does it mean to imagine a world that's gotten rid of all the imperialists, where the Wazungus aren't at the top of the food chain? What does that mean? What does it mean to live in a world that is post-Western, post-colonial, really post-colonial? We're living in post-colonial because 1960s passed, and we're just in the sense of time. But that's my question. How are you reimagining reparations beyond just the monetary sense of repairing? Yeah. Where do you move?
Organize. Okay, my name is Gerard Kamau from Kayole Community Justice Center. My reflection is about how Sungu was saying about the police state and how it is easy for a youth in Kayole to be arrested and even go through the justice system all the way to prison than getting clean air or health care in our community. That's a big concern for us because these systems, they came to oppress us, and also the way they treat our young people, the youths, is a brutality of the highest order. And I wanted also to say about the conservancies. The conservancies have come to, it's an imperial project to make these conservancies like to extract carbon credits from, is another way of exploiting our land, where the rich nations like the United Arab Emirates, the Saudis, they are coming and dispossessing us of our forests and our catchment areas. So that's our concern. Thank you.
My name is Jinji Kubai. I'd like to focus on... my question is based on what Mumbi said last. And my question is this. What can lead to a left revival in this country and also an unconstraining of the collective imaginary? And also focus on... Maybe it's an extended, but it's based on that question. Focus with a particular focus, but not limited to what ought to have been done after the people's with a particular with a particular focus, but not limited to what ought to have been done after the people's uprising last year. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for those questions. And actually, I want to start with the point that Gerald made about policing, but I want to bring that one to Owen because we were just earlier discussing this concept about boomerang. It's something that Foucault writes about, where he says that the violence that is carried out in the colonial outposts always boomerangs back into the land in the land of the colonialists. And so I want you to sort of talk a little bit about like the conversation we had about how the measures that are being carried out to suppress dissent here in Kenya, that we understand where this sort of policing came from and how that has found its way back home. Yeah, you can talk to us about the British condition, and then on the question of reparations. I think, Sungu, I would like for you to address that one, and obviously the left revival and the uprising, and maybe you can end that one on a note of a call to action. So I am tasking you with that, Mumbi, as you close out our conversation tonight.
That point about colonial boomerang is so important, and we can't understand so much of Western history without it. I mean, if we look at what happened, for example, during World War II itself, much of the horrors were the colonial violence that that Europe had exported, being concentrated back in on itself, back on the peoples who were then classed as undesirable. And that was a form that was obviously inspired by the racialized pseudoscience which emerged from the colonization of Africa, which was then applied to Jews. I mean, there's boomeranging going on there because the way that the Jewish people of Europe had been treated itself was used as a model, which was then applied, for example, to Africa, and then it boomeranged back. Adolf Hitler was a great admirer of the British Empire, particularly a big admirer of the rule of India. he spoke about how the Slavs in Eastern Europe should be treated as the English colonists treated the indigenous peoples of the Americas. I mean, that's what he specifically argued for. So obviously that point about boomeranging goes back a long way. What we're seeing in Britain today, a country which has long had a close relationship with authoritarian regimes, but also, I mean, I know here, for example, with the anti-terrorism police unit, funded partly by the UK, an ongoing financial relationship, but we've had these dubious relationships for a long time, is a clampdown on civil liberties within Britain. I mean, we've now seen a whole battery of so-called anti-terror legislation, which is then, as predicted when they're applied, end up being used against, for example, climate protesters. So what you'll see is Britain will involve itself in hideous wars like Iraq, commit terrible war crimes, and then portray the increased risk of terrorism resulting from those involvements in those wars as necessitating clampdowns on civil liberties at home, which have made the right to protest in Britain extremely precarious indeed. I mean, it's now the police have sweeping powers to shut down any protests on a whim. So you can see that relationship both in terms of British foreign policy and also its relations with the regimes. I just wanted to find just on the reparations quickly, if I may. This isn't obviously my place more generally, and obviously in terms of the monetary argument discussed there, but it's about what needs to happen within the so-called West, and that is the reckoning with our past. We mentioned it, we've been discussing, and that's why I'm here. The criminal, well, the barbaric crimes of the 1950s here, which almost no Briton will have any awareness of at all, like no awareness of. India, a really striking example. There's a brilliant book by Mike Davis, which some might be aware of, called Late Victorian Holocausts. Tens and tens of millions of Indians who were killed in those famines. In 1943, the last famine in India, it was in Bengal. Winston Churchill, a extreme racist who is obviously venerated in any discussion of that pathological racism is somehow seen as treason back home. When 3 million Indians starved to death, he said that Indians were a beastly people with a beastly religion who bred like rabbits. More broadly, I mean, King Leopold in Congo, up to 10 million who died, and yet almost no European has any understanding, awareness of that whatsoever. And so it's little wonder that we can go on to commit crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. Those crimes completely hidden from the British public, no discussion, which is why we end up where it's permissible and normalised to end up arming and facilitating a genocide, which is what is happening right now as aeroplanes full of British components burn alive Palestinian babies. Because, increasingly now the dam is beginning to break in Britain, and people who supported this genocide or refused to call it what it is from the beginning are beginning now to get a little bit queasy 19 months on after daily abominations being committed. The mass destruction of Gaza wiped off the face of the earth, the mass extermination of perhaps now the Economist, which backs it, say now up to 110,000 have died from violent injuries alone. Well, we know from the past that violent injuries are only a small fraction of the overall death toll. The destruction of the healthcare system alone imposes a daily death sentence on so many people. The intentional famine, the destruction of agriculture and food production. I mean, abominations which Israel is not trying to hide from the world. But how did we end up there? We ended up with what should be considered a joint Western, it's a American, Israeli and British genocide being committed because we were never forced to have the reckoning. We never had the reckoning with our past. And until we're forced to have that reckoning, and the European peoples more generally, a reckoning and an understanding of the horrors that we've inflicted on the world, then we will never be able to stop the continued crimes that the West is committing every single day. So that's why this is just so important. That reckoning for me has to be just the absolute heart of what happens, because as things stand, the horror of Western domination, which has now caused so much backlash against it that it is falling apart, it is disintegrating, and without that reckoning, we'll never be able to prevent the horrors that the West is every single day perpetrating against people all over the world.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you. And on the question of violence, I think we also have to look at how imperialism has contributed, in addition to the genocide in Gaza, like the continued war in the Congo, the war in Sudan, and just like war everywhere across the African continent, across the world. You know, the number of displaced people right now across the world, I think, is more than half the number that World War II produced. We literally are in the middle of a world war when you put together all the conflicts and wars going on, and we are made to look like there's a small war here, an isolated conflict here. But on the question around reparations, I think the first thing we have to note is that, especially as African people, our struggle for reparations is a just and righteous struggle. Our struggle for reparations arises out of the subjugation and the dehumanization of African people over the past maybe 5 centuries. I'm not sure if that's the period. And Mamka, if you'll just give me a few minutes. You have to look, for example, at the horrors of the slave trade. I mean, Western estimates say that 10 million people were taken from the western coast of Africa alone to the Americas to work on the plantations. And it is an underestimation. I'm sure the real figure is much higher. And a lot of these people died on transit. There's people who even threw themselves overboard because they said, I cannot be enslaved by another human being. I'd rather end my life than be an enslaved person. And so, and you know, the bottom of the sea is littered with the skeletons of African people. And so, because of the colonial patterns of economics that continue to live on to date, we still see young people from Africa trying to cross the Mediterranean into Europe. And the sea continues to claim black bodies over and over and over again across generations. Which is why it's one of the things why we have to address the climate crisis, because whole villages in Western Africa are turning dry and the soil is turning unproductive, and these young people move to the urban cities and they find that there's no work. These cities are just prisons for them and they're left with no option. I mean, by the time someone decides I'm going to cross the Sahara, then cross the Mediterranean, that person has reached the end of their rope. Back to reparations. I think there's, you know, when we talk about reparations, there's usually sometimes a very racist misconception. They say, why are Africans asking for money? Shouldn't they just focus on developing their economies in their countries? I mean, when the Jews asked for reparations following World War II, no one complained. When it was time for the Armenians to be given reparations, no one complained. When black people ask for reparations, there is now a problem. What nonsense is that? That is 5 kilograms of nonsense, very heavy. And I think reparations, yes, there's the money element that we will not shy away from saying ever, eternally in history. But it must move beyond the money. One of the most important things, and a few years ago I think I used to do some work around reparations, and one of the most important things is that there's never been a process of honest recognition of the crimes of slavery and colonialism. I think that is the starting point, recognizing that these were crimes against humanity. Because even if the money comes but there is no recognition, you see we are starting from the wrong place. For example, the Belgian king, King Felipe, in 2020, he said he conveys his deepest regrets for the crimes of the past. When I think at that time he had a visit to the Congo, to the DRC. But then the activists in the DRC were saying we need to move beyond deepest regrets. I mean, just express an apology. It will take nothing away from you. But I think beyond that, we also need to have truth and healing commissions or processes around truth and healing, because I think it's been mentioned severally here. Both colonialism and slavery were very traumatizing processes. And you know, scientists have now said that trauma can be embedded in your DNA and passed across generations. And so we then, without knowing it, I think there's ways in which the trauma of these epochs show up in our society, either through certain levels of violence, because there has never been structured processes of confronting what happened in those eras. I mean, King Leopold was cutting off the arms of the Congolese for not bringing enough rubber from the forest. You look at some of the militias in the DRC chopping off people's arms, it's because it's almost become an internalized form of violence. And I think truth and healing is something that is often forgotten when we talk about reparations. There is the question of artifacts held in European museums and which continue to earn revenues for those museums should be brought back to their original owners, because they are either of economic value, spiritual value, or cultural value. They can be used by the communities they were taken away from. If society has evolved to an extent where we have no direct use for them, they can be put in our museums and earn revenues for the national economies. So we must not reduce reparations to a question of money alone. There is human remains. A lot of human remains were taken out of the continent for study. I'm saying in quotes. Last year there was the launch of a film. I think, Wairimu, you were there when we were in Tanzania. It's called the what grave? The empty grave. Because for a lot of those who were killed by the German colonial machinery, their heads were chopped off and taken to Berlin and other places in Germany. And so these families buried bodies without heads. And so this film, it's a documentary, a really nice documentary produced by a brilliant Tanzanian filmmaker. It explores a family having to go to Germany and trying to trace the skull of their grandfather, because they want to give it a dignified burial, because also in their culture, body should be buried whole. And this happened in many countries across the African continent. Human remains were taken away. I think it's very important that these remains are brought back and given dignified burials, and also for those families to have closure, because a lot of these things happened in the 1900s. The grandchildren are alive. It's not like they happened 600 years ago or whatever. Lastly, I think this is where I began, the question of debt. This debt should be cancelled if we are talking about reparations. Debt cancellation or debt repudiation should be at one of the top questions when we talk about reparations, because truthfully, based on even the conversation we've had today, I think Africa doesn't really owe anyone anything, and we are not apologetic about that. We have to be very clear that much more has been taken from the African continent and the African people than what is claimed to have been given to them. And lastly, land reform, because colonial patterns of land ownership are still alive to date. The Swinnerton Plan in Kenya, for example, which came into force in 1954, 56, I'm not sure, maybe 54. It happened at the height of, so Swinnerton was an agricultural officer, British agricultural officer, and at the height of the struggle for national liberation, when the combatants were in the forest, he started a process of land consolidation. And you had to register your parcel of land. And so a lot of the people who were engaged in the struggle for national liberation, because they were in the forest, were never able to register their land, which is why majority of those who are squatters in this country today are children of the freedom fighters. And so how can we not talk about land reform when we talk about land when we talk about reparations, this was a settler colony. The whole economic system was anchored around land and the exploitative relations that could arise out of that control of the land and the labor. I think there's so much things to do, and I think the struggle for reparations must also achieve a unified form, and it must be given the importance it deserves, because in the 21st century, the struggle for reparations is at the heart of the struggle for complete decolonization. Thank you.
I'll be quick. So this question around public and collective imagination. Okay, so I think there's the importance of us thinking about who is currently constraining public imagination. I asked the question, what is good governance? I think part of the reason that our public imagination is really constrained is because of our obsession with legalism and constitutionalism. I'm sorry. There's a deep obsession and legal fetishism in this country, which means that we can never get to the heart of systemic questions. Ultimately the law is a tool for whoever has power. So we can talk as much as we want about how the state is being unconstitutional, but really this is a question of power that we need to get into the heart of. And of course I understand why people use the Constitution as a tool, but it can't be the limit of our imaginations, and so often it is. And it's actually a question Oyoo and I have often. And so I bring that up to say that, Amilcar Cabral, who was really thinking about this question of, class suicide, for example. And when there's an essay that he wrote called Weapon of Theory. It was actually a speech. And he was really trying to think about what is it that's actually preventing an African revolution from materializing. And ultimately he was thinking about how it was the bourgeoisie or petty bourgeoisie. It was also what we think of today as the professional class, which I am also a part of. And we are the ones who constrain people's imagination to this question of legalism and constitutionalism. It's us. And so I think in order for us to really rethink and to re-energize the public imagination, we really have to stop thinking about professional associations, NGOs as the sites of organizing. We really need to think about organizing as something that we're doing in solidarity with working classes in this country who have already been doing it. Whatever happened last year was the result of working classes, peasants across Kenya who had been organizing for years already. It did not come out of nowhere. And so if we're thinking about that, and we're thinking about how Marxists say that culture is a product of struggle, then the only way to reshape public imagination in Kenya is to organize and to do it radically within a Marxist and socialist tradition, which people are already doing. It's us to join at this point. And so I was asked to leave with a call to action. I can't make one of everyone, but I can certainly make one of those who are like myself, who certainly need to be thinking about what we need to give up in order to truly be in solidarity. Because solidarity should not just be a statement, it should be a material thing, right? So what I'm saying is that we need to disrupt the current calculus, wherein those who risk everything are those who experience the brunt of everyday capitalist and neocolonial violence. We have to develop a solidarity that is about democratizing risk, not reinforcing the logics of inequality that make solidarity necessary in the first place. Solidarity should make a stem out of thorns. It should never just be a balm. Yeah, I leave you with that.
I mean, I was going to take another round of questions, but I think we cannot do that because that is the ending we needed. This conversation was amazing. I had chills down my spine for half of it. And I hope it was energizing for all of you too. So I would like to thank once more the Macmillan Library for making room for us to have this conversation. I would like to thank Ukombozi Library who co-hosted this event with us. Yeah, and Calotropis. Why am I forgetting you? I am so sorry for forgetting you for giving us the technical support we have needed. I would like to thank Chief Matigari for the great performance that he just gave. And I would like to thank you. Owen Jones is an columnist for The Guardian. I don't think I said that earlier. And a writer of many, many, many books. Sungu Oyoo, poet, author, activist. Mumbi Kanyongo, writer, researcher, mutual fund organizer. Wairimu Gadhimba, who of a certain amount of madness, who is responsible for making sure we are all here today, and all of you who have sat through this conversation. And I like the fact that I like the fact that today we've had a very mixed group. Usually we have people in the movement and people on the left, mostly in this room, but today we've had a very mixed group. And I think, Owen, you have something to do with that. So please come more often. And I am disappointed in all of you that nobody made him cry. I was hoping to see someone, yeah. And yes. So follow A Certain Amount of Madness on X. Follow us on YouTube. We release an episode at least once every 2 weeks discussing issues in depth in this way. We identified the podcast was created towards the end of last year because during the protests we identified that there was this gap in this type of analysis. I mean, a lot of what we have as media provides very descriptive analysis of what is happening, and the sort of like constraints of imagination that also constrain how we're able to see what is possible and how we're able to see the interconnecting threads and the systems that have led us to where we are. And that is what that podcast is trying to address. And we have an episode on debt coming out sometime early next week. And we are looking forward to having all of you listening to us and doing all of this again. So before we close, I think Sefusani is here. Can you come and lead us in Wimbo wa Mapambano, please? More power. Get up, get up.
Viva, comrades, viva. More power to the people, more power. So we will put our left fist against our chests like this. And we will do the song. That we lost during the June 25th. Kupigwa na kupokonywa maisha hakutatuzuia sisi wananchi kunyakuwa uhuru wetu na ya jasho letu na haki ya jasho letu tumekataa kupiga magoti mbele ya hawa wauaji bila shaka sisi pia ni watu, hali ya utumwa tumeikataa, hali ya utumwa tumeikataa. Tutanyakuwa mashamba yetu, tupiganie uhuru utamaduni na viwanda vyetu, utamaduni na viwanda vyetu. Sisi hatutaki kudhulumiwa, hatutaki tena mauaji, ili kupetuli angushe haki na uhuru zichanue, haki na uhuru zichanue, na uhuru wetu wa Kenya, uhuru wetu wa Kenya, tupiganie, na wazalendo wetu Kenya wa Kenya, wazalendo wetu wa Kenya, tuwakumbuke, na mabinti zetu Kenya wa Kenya, mabinti zetu wa Kenya, tuwatetee, na katiba yetu, katiba yetu wa Kenya, tutekeleze. Holeyo, holeyo, holeyo. And I'll just take this opportunity to invite you, if you are available on the 25th of May, we celebrate African Liberation Day, and we will be at the Kenya National Theatre at the Ukumbi Mdogo. We will have a lot of these conversations. We'll be talking about revolutionary Pan-Africanism and how we can fight imperialism in the globe. So, karibuni sana.
All right, thank you everybody, and see you next time.